But I would say one of the most powerful things that they can do is vote with their wallets. Because every time they step into a grocery store, every time they go on that e-commerce platform and they make that conscious choice of I'm going to buy this coffee brand over this other coffee brand, this tea brand over this other tea brand, they are sending a signal to the market about what they truly care about. And when they choose sustainability, when they choose ethical products, when they choose products that are actually doing good for the planet and being conscious, nothing moves the needle more than that. Because today we work with 500 brands, like you said, and almost every single one of them came to us because the consumers were asking them for it. They were asking them for change, and that's really what pushed that action in it.
Welcome back for another episode of The Voice of Generation Climate TVOGC. Today we have with us Svanika, who's the CEO of rePurpose Global, a full stack plastic action platform. Svanika, what a pleasure to have you with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure being here. I love the concept of Gen Z, and I'm really excited to dig in.
Yes, you are a Gen Z founder. Your company is a Gen Z company. And a lot of the customers that you've served, more than 500 brands, are Gen Z brands as well, right? We've all opted into some form of climate action. What does it mean to build a Gen Z company for you? Can you tell us about rePurpose, the history, and really like what got you into it too? I want to know the inception point, the journey till here so far, and then we'll dive into some specific examples.
Yeah, those are a lot of questions. I'll start from the beginning. We'll go chronologically, and I hope I answer all of those on the way. But yeah, so on my part, I was born in India in this tiny little city, Coimbatore, and I grew up in the Middle East, and I spent most of my life in Oman up until I was 17 years old, and then I went to the US for university. It was a fun journey because I think this is how I got into UPenn. It's the most ridiculous story. When I was growing up, my granddad, my grandparents, a lot of them were activists, and they were very, very involved in the nonprofit space. And I loved that. I think I gained so much knowledge about the authentic work that they were doing, about how to create grassroots change. But at the end of their career, right, they were 60 years old at that point. I look back, and they look back, and they said, we've tried to do so much, but we've only accomplished a fair amount of change. But the big things, right, the systems have really not changed. And one part of that was being a nonprofit, right? Like depending on grant financing, depending on nonprofit philanthropic funding coming in to create change, it really slowed things down. It really didn't decelerated in many ways the change that they were trying to create. And so my granddad was like, if you want to do something, ideally do it in a way that has much more scale. Do it in a top-down way, really creates some change. And so when I was in 12th grade, I literally just Googled best universities to understand how money works. And that's all I knew about economics and finance and that whole industry. And Penn came up and Wharton came up as like one of the top universities, and I applied. And by some fluke, I got in. And so that's really the way in which I approached impact as well, which was that I really wanted to follow the legacy of what my family had been doing for a very long time when it came to creating change. But at the same time, I wanted to do it at a much larger scale, and I wanted to do it in a much more financially sustainable way, in a way that was integrated with the mainstream economy and not really relegated to quote unquote not-for-profit work. And so that's kind of a lot of my Penn journey. And when I was a senior at Penn, I was in this honors program, and that's where I needed to write a thesis, and I could have picked any topic very serendipitously. My now co-founders, who back then were my co-authors on that thesis, we decided to write about the economics of informal waste management. And so I was just really fascinated by the idea that garbage, quite literally trash, could be a multi-billion-dollar industry. And then there was like this big underbelly that was unregulated, informal, exploitative, corrupt. And so through the course of that year, as we were writing that thesis, we would get these little grants, $1,000 here, $500 there, and we would use that to go to all of these different countries, South America, Africa, Asia, like really go and study the patterns of exploitation. What happens to our waste when we create it? Where does it end up? What is the government doing? What is the private sector doing? And so on. And at the end of that year, I had this 200-page paper that nobody was going to read. But even more importantly, we had this realization that the way the system was broken was actually very pattern matchable, because whether you looked at Colombia or Brazil or Cameroon or Ghana or India or Indonesia, you kept finding the same patterns of how things were not working. And the nice thing about that, the silver lining there, is if they're broken in all the same ways, then maybe there is one solution that will work across the board, one way to fix that waste management supply chain, or really the way the circular economy works. So yeah, I think I still remember this conversation. My co-founders, I have two co-founders. When we were about to graduate, we got dinner one day and we looked at each other and we said, I think we owe ourselves 1 year of our lives. Like I will give you 1 year of my life and we'll just try to see what we can accomplish in that 1 year. And if nothing, we can always go back and try something else. But at least let's give this a shot. And that's, yeah, that I hope
And
answers your question about
yes,
how we
yes.
got into this space.
And I think what stands out from there is capitalism for good. Like in looking for where to go to college, you looked up how do I make money, or like what will allow me to make money. Wharton came up, and at school you've learned about what problem statement you wanted to solve, which is how do I make money but also create impact. And capitalism for good is the lever you found to scale that impact. Right? Because you're right, like a
Yeah.
not-for-profit approach cannot really scale this impact. It has to be creation of the right incentives, create an ecosystem where people can make money, and the net benefit is environmental impact.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, and you probably find this in your work as well, right? When we take a for-profit lens to
Yeah.
things that have historically been seen as non-profit, not only are we finding the right incentives for the private sector to participate in it, right? For brands and other companies to come in and put money into it. I think the impact itself ends up being a lot more efficient because we need to think about every dollar invested and making sure that the impact KPIs have the same rigor as any other KPI that a for-profit company would be looking at. And so at least in our experience, we found that we have been able to put the dollars to work at sometimes 10, 20, 30x rates of what a nonprofit would be getting from that same capital. And so I do think it ends up working better both for the planet, for the impact, as well as the stakeholders involved as well. And I'm sure you're seeing this every single day
Yeah, for
too.
sure, for sure. I think what you at rePurpose do and what we at Climes do is similar in a sense. We are behavior change companies, and it's about designing the right incentives. In your case, to avoid and remove plastic, and in our case, to avoid and remove carbon. And it's by designing the right incentives for stakeholders, right? For consumer brands, for enterprises, that eventually benefit the project developers who are doing the good work of carbon avoidance, plastic avoidance, or plastic removal, right? So without the right incentives, which is typically financial incentives, yeah, like projects just die down, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
And I think this is so true what you're saying, not just for anything, not just for plastic, not just for waste, not just for climate. I think if you look at every single impact area. We have been trying to solve quite literally the same SDGs for decades now. Whether it's women empowerment, civic society, whether it's education and literacy, all sorts of things, right? I mean, you can list, and then if you go back and look 60 years, 70 years ago, the list was probably the same. And we've made some amount of progress, but it's not like we have achieved the breakneck speeds that we've seen in like tech, for example, in where AI or software, or the kind of speeds of growth that you see in some of these other industries, and impact has been much slower in comparison. And so I really do believe that taking this capitalism for good, this do well by doing good approach, it really does accelerate any impact area that you might be thinking of.
Interesting. Is there any insight you and both your co-founders had when you were starting rePurpose that eventually turned out to be true, right? And it was validated by the market? And is there something you fully believed to be would come true but was completely disproven? Because that's what we start companies with, right? We have some contrarian view and then you have to prove whether it's going to play out or not. So what part came true and what part was completely factually disproven?
Oh, that's a very good question. That's a very interesting question. I've never been asked this before. So I think the initial hypothesis that we had, which did come true, was that there would be people willing to pay for trash, right? Like that this is quite literally garbage and we're going to valorize it. So for some of the listeners who don't know what we do at rePurpose, a large part of our work today is building waste management supply chains around the world and gap financing hard to recycle materials being collected and recycled. So what that means is something like PET, your hard plastic bottles. In places like India, you already have a recovery rate of 70% almost, because it's easy to recycle and there's an end market for that. People are clamoring to get the recycled PET material and use that back. However, you have materials like MLP, multi-laminate plastic packaging, your chips packets, your candy wrappers, things like that, that nobody wants to pick up because it's so small, it's so hard to clean, it's so expensive to do anything with, recycle, upcycle, whatever we look at. And so because of that, they rarely get the recovery rate for that is under 5%. And so that's one example. But what rePurpose does is identifies these sorts of underserved parts of the supply chain of whether it's collection, whether it's door-to-door recovery from houses, or whether it's coastline recovery, whatever it is. And we fund those and we build the right infrastructure, we build the right supply chain to get that going. So in the state of Kerala, for example, I'm very proud of this fact. In the time that rePurpose has been active, just through our work and in our capital there, we have been able to double the collection of that multi-laminate plastic packaging in the entire state of Kerala. And so things like that is what we do. And so my hypothesis that if you make it interesting, if there is a marketing value add for brands to participate in this, they will come quite literally pay you to pick garbage. I think that was a hypothesis that definitely got validated. As we sort of started scaling and the way brands get incentivized on our part is we give them different claims and certifications. So our most popular program is the plastic neutral certification, where brands measure how much plastic they're putting out into the environment, and then they fund us and we remove an equivalent amount and give credit for that back to them, and then they're able to talk about that to their consumers, and then work with their consumers on that. So I think that whole system of right now, the majority of our brands come from North America. So we are connecting, a brand sitting somewhere in New York or Kansas or California with impact projects that are happening in Indonesia or Colombia or Brazil or India. And
Typically
so that
along the equator, right?
hypothesis.
All your projects are very close to the equator, is what I've understood.
It's all coastlines. The way we look at it is the most vulnerable coastlines, and it just so happens that most of the ones that are actually in a high vulnerability position are along the equator, because you have rivers that are bringing it in and so on. So I think this hypothesis that coming out of nowhere, right? Like I'm not a chemical engineer, I know nothing about waste management, but we can bring the world together. We can get, these completely different cultures, these completely different people working as part of one unified system and getting excited to be part of this movement and then sharing in that journey with each other. I think that was something highly ambitious, and I'm very fortunate to have been able to prove out through the last half a decade or so. The other question you asked me is what was maybe completely disproven and maybe
But
what
did you
completely didn't
fully
work.
believe, if it would have played out, the world would have been a better place, you would have created a bunch of impact, but it didn't get validated by the market, right? And it
Yeah. And funnily enough, it was consumer participation. I think and then there are different ways that consumers need to participate in this story, right? Like we're writing a story of change, everybody has a role to play. And my initial hypothesis was that for a lot of consumers, it was going to be them taking action by sorting waste themselves, right? So we have my first product actually, it was an Uber for trash where the concept was that, okay, don't litter, right? Like if you don't know where to put a particular waste product, we will tell you and then you can store it, you can sort it and keep it in your house and then someone will come and collect it. And in India, like it would be like connecting them with kabadiwalas or raddiwalas, and then someone would come collect it and go. So that way, nothing recyclable accidentally ends up in a landfill. You're improving the system overall. And that completely did not work. We built the app, no one used it. It was definitely, not successful at all. And that's when we started saying, okay, let's move upstream and let's start working with brands. And my realization from that, two things I would say, lots of learnings from that and as an entrepreneur, but I think from a systems change perspective, I had two things, which was one, I do believe that we should not be offloading the burden of sustainability onto our consumers because so much of the narrative that I see all the time is that consumers are not conscious. It is their fault for like littering. It is their fault. It is the consumer's fault for anything, right? Like not taking a sustainable action. But the reality is all consumers, all people are willing to do the right thing if it is just efficient, if it is easy to do, if it is the cheaper option to do. So you can't go to someone who's, like barely waking up in the morning and getting to work on time and try to ask them to like sort every single piece of their waste and then keep it stored and have the right downstream, like behaviors for them to opt into. I think that is way too much of a burden to put on consumers when the reality is if we have the right supply chains, if the brands are using the right materials, if the waste management companies are set up the right way, it's so easy for the consumer to participate in that. If they don't have to pay 5 times more money to buy a more sustainable product, but you can get the same quality at the same price, why wouldn't a consumer, choose this brand over another brand? And so I think there is a lot more to be said about the role that we play as entrepreneurs and innovators, the role that the private sector plays to make the system efficient for the consumer. Because I fully believe that if that is there, then they will take the right action. And the second learning that I had from that was actually that it's really following that same thread. One of the most important things that consumers can do is more than sorting their waste, more than honestly, I mean, yes, everyone should be sorting their waste, everyone should be doing these things if you can. But I would say one of the most powerful things that they can do is vote with their wallets. Because every time they step into a grocery store, every time they go on that e-commerce platform and they make that conscious choice of I'm going to buy this coffee brand over this other coffee brand, this tea brand over this other tea brand, they are sending a signal to the market about what they truly care about. And when they choose sustainability, when they choose ethical products, when they choose, products that are actually doing good for the planet and being conscious, nothing moves the needle more than that. Because today we work with 500 brands, like you said, and almost every single one of them came to us because the consumers were asking them them for it. They were asking them for change. And then that's really what pushed that action in and of.
It's a really, really interesting insight. I mean, you had a hypothesis that didn't prove out, but there's a lot of lessons in that. And I find that fascinating that as a behavior change company, you realize that it's the brand brand or enterprise you work with that needs to design a system that rewards consumers and incentivizes them to do better rather than penalize people directly, right? Like you can't go around asking people to change their daily habits or their daily life. That's too much burden. It's too much just thinking burden. It's too much of an obligation on each individual to do. And what I'm being reminded of is, I don't know if you ever saw Noam Chomsky's, this is kind of dark, but like Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent. If you read it or watched it, have you?
This was my high school physics professor made all of us read it.
It's incredible. Old principles, but applied into all of society. And a lot of the choices we make are not really choices, right? They're already pre-packaged between options that you can choose
The
from.
illusion of choice.
Illusion of choice. And somewhere even I felt that with climate action to become mainstream, and when I say climate action, so waste, water, carbon, energy, air pollution, the choices we are offered systems-wise already need to be pre-packaged to be better choices. Right?
Yes.
And then people can choose better amongst that, like you said, with their wallets.
Yeah.
And that
Absolutely.
is really,
That
really
is so
powerful.
very well put. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. We just need to, there's always going to be a range in society, right? There's
Yeah.
always going to be like a bell curve of like there's a certain percentage of the population that will care a lot, and there's a certain percentage that will not care at all, and then the vast majority of us fall somewhere in between. And I think the range of options that we give to that bell curve of people who care needs to be constantly, the bar keeps, need to be
Yeah.
increased. Because otherwise it will always, go down to the worst of the lot, right? And I'll give you an example. If you think about multi-laminate plastic packaging, normally these, the 1 rupee sachets you get of like shampoos and the
Yeah.
conditioners, you can buy it in. It's a 1 rupee sachet, and you only get one hair wash out of it. Horrible for the environment, right? Like that 1 rupee sachet cannot be recycled, and it's really, really detrimental. Rarely gets recovered as well. However, now what is the best alternative to buying your shampoo? Ideally, you buy a soap, like one of those like soap shampoos that are coming out these days, or you have a container that you can. It's like a 1 liter container. You can go back and refill it, and you don't have to keep buying the piece of that container again and again. But buying that 1 liter container that you can go refill, maybe it's a thicker material, is probably going to be about 200 times more expensive, 300 times more expensive than that 1 rupee sachet. And the person who is buying that 1 rupee sachet, they're buying it because they cannot afford a full pack of shampoo. Like maybe this is a mother who really wants her child to take, wash her hair before, going to school and then having picture day, and then having their photo taken. And there's absolutely no way that she's going to spend 500 rupees on a refillable shampoo bottle when, she's probably barely making ends meet, right? That's who that 1 rupee sachet is catered towards. That's the demographic there. And so whose responsibility is it, when you think about it, to provide the more sustainable alternative? It absolutely is not on the consumer. It's not on the people to pick and choose what they can and cannot consume. It really is on the brand. It really is on all of these other private sector industries that exist to move the needle forward on what a sustainable product looks like.
Yeah, I agree. I was actually thinking of a parallel example with the energy industry, right? So if you take a sachet and a refillable bottle and compare it to, coal energy to come in your home on the grid versus your own solar plant on your house,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
There's a parallel to be made over there. The second one takes an investment upfront. Total cost of
Yeah.
ownership is lower, right? Your refillable
Yes.
bottle is going to be so much cheaper in the long run. So is your solar
Yes.
energy plant. But
Yes.
how
Yeah.
is it communicated? It's typically not communicated very effectively in terms of total cost of ownership. And I think you can't blame people for that. Like one of our biggest
Yeah.
takeaways doing behavior change has been to change any behavior, it almost always follows the same four-step loop. The first one is you have to convince people it's obviously required, right? With great communication. The second one is it has to be easily accessible. The solution has to be easily accessible. The third one is it has to be economically viable, either immediately or like life cycle. And fourth is it has to be fun to use, like easy, no friction.
Yeah.
You just run
Yeah.
day and night without like being very bothersome. And if that happens, then you can keep reinforcing it and becomes a habit. Whether it's going to the gym, whether it's like renewable energy in your home, whether it's refillable bottle, anything at all. And I think we oftentimes like stumble in one of those steps with, especially with climate and sustainability solutions.
Yeah.
Not considered affordable, it's not considered easy to use, it's communicated wrong, right?
Yeah.
And that's where I feel like we're lacking, we're falling short. But if we were to pre-design those choices before an individual even got to make a choice, how cool would that be?
I love that. I love that. That's a very nice framework. I really like that. That's a really neat framework to think about, all the components that we need to go through. And maybe one suggestion I'd have on like forcing us, right? Forcing entrepreneurs, forcing brand owners, and anyone in the private sector is to build for scale. Because oftentimes the reason why we fall or falter in one of those steps that you mentioned is because it probably works for like a small population. It probably works. Whatever you build, there's a market for it, right? Like it's there because there's a market for it. But that particular market is not enough. Like capturing 100% of the market that we first built for, it's just one village or like one small society or 1% of like the I don't know, high schoolers that you're going after, whatever it might be, homeowners that you're going after. But if we're really seeing how do we expand the total addressable market, how do we expand the scale, like try to do this at like 10x, 100x the volume, I think that will automatically force us to then acknowledge that, okay, it's one of those things that you mentioned, right? Like one of those 4 areas that is probably not working every time we try to scale. And so let's solve for that. Let's fix for that. And then you keep fixing one after the other. And then I think then it becomes a virtuous flywheel from there.
Yeah, I agree. Built for scale for sure. And I think the simpler the system is, the more it can be adopted at scale as well. Right? The more complex and the more levers there are in that system, the more points of failure there will be for it not to scale.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
The simpler
yeah.
it is, the more it can scale. So it seems to me
Very
like
true.
from your journey, it's the consumer brand or the enterprise that should be responsible to mainstream plastic action, right? Is that who the responsibility lies with? More than the consumer and more than policymakers? Is it primarily the brands or enterprises you work with?
I think it's everybody. Everybody has a role to play, right? I think that it's just identifying what that role is. I think when we say only one person, one stakeholder has the responsibility or the accountability to create change, I think that absolves other stakeholders from having to take action as well. I believe everybody has some responsibility, and I think that the responsibility of the consumer is to vote with their wallets, is to choose the best that they can and send those right signals to the brands and the enterprises. I do think the role of the brands and the enterprises is to create the better products. However, at the same time, I absolutely do believe that it is the role of the policymakers and the regulators to provide the right regulatory incentives for brands to make that decision as well. Now, brands will do something for 2 reasons, right? Either it increases their top line or it reduces their costs. Either you're going to make more money or you're going to, pay less money out. And I'm being very simplistic here, but the reality is still the same, whether it's through the consumers or through the governments or, any other stakeholder. If a brand feels like by making a sustainable choice, I am going to do better as a company, they're going to make that choice. That once incentives are aligned, it's a no-brainer. Or if they feel like now EPR is coming in, all of these other packaging taxes are coming in, I have to pay less in taxes. That's another incentive, that's still going to help me grow my business. And so I do think I'm a big believer that capitalism works, but it does have externalities. You do have negative externalities, and that's why governments exist. Governments exist to deal with those negative externalities and boost the positive externalities. Because if you just let the free market run, it is not going to be optimal. The free market with free reins will never be optimal. And so that check and balance needs to be there.
Where have you found, in what part of the world have you found this cocktail to work really well? Where it's the consumer brand or enterprise you work with has the right incentives and motivation, the consumers care enough, and policy lever from the government is also there to enable it. And it's all come together really neatly to become a shining case in point. Which one of your locations have you seen the most success in?
I think it's happening all over the world. I think it's been really nice to see that in the last few years that we've been in this space, there's already been so much progress. I mean, if you take even a place like India, EPR laws and in the way they were being enforced, a few years ago versus how much more seriously they're being taken today, there's already been so much progress. Or right now, we're also part of the Global Plastics Treaty process. Like the United Nations is pulling all of these countries together to write the very first Global Plastics Treaty, which is, you can think of it as similar to how the Paris Accords, the climate protocols were way back in the day. And so I think there's so much progress that is being made across different countries. And I'm seeing that same consumer momentum as well. Even again, 5-6 years ago, I wouldn't have expected the Indian consumer to be as mindful, as involved in this space as they are today. So I am actually widely optimistic. I'm optimistic about really all regions of the world.
Yeah, no, but it always helps to identify, a case in point, and then try and make that the model everywhere else too, right? Not everywhere in the world are policy makers really enabling. In a lot of places, they're curtailing, not enabling.
It goes back and forth. The ideal case in point to make something templated out of is probably just theoretical. And there is no one country that I can point to where that flywheel has worked perfectly. I do think the EU is probably ahead of the curve. And so the kind of policies that we're seeing coming out of the EU in general are probably the best so far. And then the EU is being closely followed now by a lot of nations in Africa, a lot of nations in Asia as well. And so I think those are the regions that I'm much more optimistic about. But even places like the US, where generally things have been much slower, sustainability often is a bipartisan issue. And things like plastic, things like waste I've just seen even in the recent couple of months, it's gone through as a bipartisan issue. So yeah, maybe if I had to point, it would probably be the EU, but in general, I think we're moving closer across the world.
Nice. That's inspiring for sure. Gives hope. Um, as a founder, what is your one big hope for the future? You've been building for 5 years now. Where does rePurpose go from here? What would you consider a success? Obviously, the goalpost keeps shifting, and with impact, you've never really truly won.
Done.
Like, there's
Yeah.
no finish line. But what would you be really proud of having built? Thinking back to when you and your two co-founders chose to turn that thesis into a 1-year-long experiment that turned into a company. What would have at least closed that chapter to say, okay, that was totally worth it?
Yeah, great question. I think there's an impact answer, there's a philosophical answer, there's a company answer. My impact answer is really that I want to scale rePurpose into that one-stop shop, into this vehicle that really allows anybody to participate in the circular economy. Today we have, we've done some studies on our end, some consulting papers that show that we need roughly $5.2 trillion flowing into the circular economy over the next few decades if we want to bring down any litter, any leakage of waste down to down by 95%. And so that's really saying basically if we don't want litter, if we don't want waste out there where it shouldn't be, we need about $5.2 trillion. And so my goal is how do I build the right incentive? Like we have software, we have certification programs, we have claims, we have all sorts of things that we do, and how do we spread this to as many brands, as many enterprises as we can, in a way that we are bringing in the capital needed to achieve the impact that we need at scale. Now, having said that, I think my more philosophical answer of why I think this is this ambitious, I'm literally saying we should end the plastic crisis in the next few decades. And I think it's absolutely possible, right? Because this also comes from my grandfather. I honestly can't take credit for too many of my philosophical ideas. It's all borrowed ideas. But I remember when I was younger, I would ask him, there are so many problems with the world, right? Like you wake up, and especially for us growing up with the internet, it just seemed like every day there was a new problem. There's religious problems, there's like all sorts of caste discrimination, there's problems with gender equality, literacy. There's just so much that someone needs to contend with. And oftentimes it can feel very hopeless because you're taking 2 steps forward, in one of those areas and 10 steps backward in a different area, and it just like feels like there's just so much pressure on us to solve for everything. And what he said was basically, you're not, your generation is not unique to feeling this. It just feels like, okay, like there's a lot on you, but the reality is every single generation, every single person who was born on this planet from like 10,000 years ago was born into some sort of crisis. The crisis just changed, but there was always some sort of crisis. And all we've been doing is solving one and creating another. And so your responsibility is not to create a utopia. There is no utopia, right? Your responsibility is just to make sure that your children don't have to solve the same problems that you are solving, because they'll have their own problems. The society will evolve, they'll have their own problems to deal with, and you shouldn't just hand over the same problems. And so I found that very reaffirming, because I think then that allows us to just sort of take a step back and say, this is a problem that I have chosen to solve. This is a problem that my generation can feasibly solve. All the ingredients are starting to come together. And so if we just, put the gas in, right? Like, push on the pedals, this problem of the waste crisis or the plastic crisis, I fully believe all the ingredients are there for me to solve, or not for us to solve, right? Like for rePurpose, for all of us to come together to solve in this generation. And then I think there's just other issues that we are creating as we speak that future generations will have to contend.
That is really, really beautiful. I like that. Like, there's always going to be some problem or the other. It's just a question of which problems you choose to work on solving. Especially for our future generations, like the problems will still be there. It'll be different ones, but hopefully they're better problems.
Yeah.
Not the same as not as bad. Like if you think back
Yeah.
500 years ago, I think they had way worse problems than we have
Yeah.
today.
Yeah.
People back then were fighting with the plague and like being sure if they're going to wake up in the morning, and maybe
Yeah.
someone's going to come crashing through my door and kill me. Like very different problems.
Different problems. I mean, probably feels just as extreme to every generation going through it because we haven't known anything else, right? So it's hard for anybody to make a comparison. But absolutely, I mean, there's these crazy facts that even just a few decades ago, you couldn't take a hot shower for granted. Like the idea of waking up in the morning and having a warm hot shower, that is such a basic part of life right now that you couldn't take for granted. Or my other favorite fact about this is how I think someone from the 1800s, a farmer from the 1800s, England, for example, would have gone his entire life without having more flavor than what is in a single Cheeto. Like, the chip, like the Cheetos like you get, the amount of flavor that is in one single one of that, it would not have, like, in his entire lifetime, probably would not have had that much cumulatively, right? So it's just wild to think about how far we have come. But I think, and I'm sure the problems, will be better going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, that's really really it's an interesting thought for sure. Problems will always be there, but I think as long as the average of the problems is getting better problems, becoming better problems,
Yeah.
that's something really amazing to aspire toward and leave our future generations with. Not to tell them that
Yeah.
you're going to have no problems, because that's not true,
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
right? Well, hopefully we solve the climate change problem in our generation's time and we don't leave this as a problem we're going to pass on to future generations. That would be a really big win, right? Through rePurpose's work, Climes' work, and very many other companies like ours.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if you ask me what gives hope, it is knowing that there are so many people like working towards this, right? It's so cool to see what Climes is doing. It is so cool to see all of the innovation that is coming up in this space right now. So I think I am very hopeful that that will leave better problems for our future
Amazing,
generations.
amazing. Hope and optimism. That's what's going to drive us forward and bring us a better, not utopian future, but a better future.
Yeah, yeah, a less problematic future. Yeah.
Swanika, what a pleasure to have you with us today on this episode of TVOGC. It's been really, really fun talking to you.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much for having me.